While looking up some canyon pictures on Google and other cool canyon-style environments on ArtStation, I decided to create my own canyon western environment in Blender. After gathering my references for the style, I started with a blockout. First, I positioned the camera to get the right angle, then began working on the shapes and overall blockout I was aiming for. I really wanted a detailed foreground, a vast midground, and mountains in the background. For the first mountains, I just used a height map and a displacement modifier. Right after that, I worked on the camera animation. I just used Camera Shakify and played a bit with the setting until I was happy. I always like to start early with the lighting, so I imported an HDRI that matches the environment. I rotated it and adjusted the strength until it looked good. With the blockout and lighting done, I started placing wooden trunks for the fence. Then I used a path curve and ran it through the trunks, adjusting some parts up and others down. I applied barbed wire along the curve so that the curve acts as a controller. Next, I just used a rock from Quixel and replaced the blockout with it. For the mountains, I used a model I found online and placed it along the horizon multiple times. I changed the scale and rotation to add more variety. I also applied a ground texture while working on the mountains. Now coming to the most important part, vegetation. For scattering, I used GeoScatter. I got it through the Blender Market Super Bundle a few weeks ago. But don't click away just yet, haha. The scatter tool I used in all my previous videos is actually free and has almost all the same functions as the GeoScatter add-on, so you can still follow along using that one. I've linked it in the description. I started by looking at the reference images I showed at the beginning. While going through them, I began with a small grass layer. I used 2 or 3 grass assets for the main ground cover, rotated them, and randomized their scale. Next, I placed some dry bushes. Almost every time I add a new layer, I use the pattern option. It gives the most realistic results. Things like flowers, grass, moss, and similar elements usually grow in patches or clusters, not just randomly everywhere. In GeoScatter, you can achieve the same effect by simply using a noise texture. I added more grasses and bushes using the pattern option. After that, I used a ground asset and scattered it all over the floor to make the ground look more detailed. This time, I didn't use the pattern option because I wanted it to appear everywhere. To optimize the scene right away, I use camera culling. This option tells each layer to only appear when it's visible to the camera. I set the range slightly wider than just the camera view to make sure it doesn't remove assets that are still visible at the edges of the frame. I also added some rocks because I thought the scene looked too flat. I rotated and scaled them as well to add more variation. One option I absolutely love about GeoScatter is the display as function. It lets you display all the grasses, bushes, and other assets as low poly versions, which really boosts viewport performance. Plus, it actually looks pretty cool too. Now I had to do the same thing again, but for the large landscape. I couldn't just apply the scale and start scattering because the first layer would have crashed Blender right away, so instead I manually scaled the assets. I made sure they looked realistic but not too small, so I wouldn't have to crank up the count like crazy. While looking at my references, I noticed that many canyon deserts have a large amount of bushes in the background, so I did the same, and it really helped enhance the scene. To figure out how many assets are actually visible on the large terrain, I added some atmosphere. I used a sphere with a principal volume shader, gave it a slight blue tint, and added a very low amount of emission. For the large landscape, I had around 10 layers. I used different grass and bush assets, sticks, cacti, rocks, and some larger ground rock assets. I'm not sure if it made a big difference in the final render, but I used a displacement map with a subdivision modifier. Of course, I used adaptive subdivision, otherwise it would have been impossible to handle. Up close, it looks pretty nice, but I'm not sure it was really necessary. At this point, I changed a few things. I used another rock model for the foreground and also scattered some grass on it to add more detail. I also made some changes to the foreground vegetation since I wasn't quite happy with it. I looked at more references and tried to get closer to that look. I adjusted the rocks as well. To add a bit more story, I placed a small campfire with a cowboy hat next to it. Now everything feels more cohesive and looks better together. The last step was adding a horse. I found a free horse model on Blender Kit from this creator. Luckily, the horse was already rigged, so I just had to convert the rig into an IK rig. I also had to redo some weight painting in a few areas because the bones were acting weird. By the way, should I do a detailed tutorial on how to convert a regular rig into an IK rig, like I did in my Quiet Place video, or maybe even a full rigging tutorial? If you're interested, let me know in the comments. I also tweaked the material a bit and added some fur so the horse looks more detailed, especially when the sunlight hits him. After that, I looked up horse walk videos online and tried to match the movement as closely as possible. I think it turned out pretty decent. And that's it, the environment is done. And not to forget, I also did some compositing. First I put all the render passes back together, then I added motion blur and defocus by slightly blurring the background. I used crypto mats to tweak some specific elements. I also exported the Blender camera into Nuke to add a nice background sky and some volume rays to make the scene more interesting. The final touches were lens dirt, glow, chromatic aberration, lens distortion, and a few other effects. And bam, that's it. Let's have a look at how it turned out. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any feedback or questions, feel free to drop them in the comments or message me on Instagram. Don't forget to subscribe and see you soon.